I'm doing neuroscience and applied neuroscience for the past 20 plus years, basically studying how we as humans are making decisions, both as consumers, as everyday users, as managers, leaders, and things like that. But for the past 10 years, at least, I've been really kind of focused very much on consumer behavior, at least through my company, Neurons. And for many years, we've focused on EEG, eye tracking, behavioral science to measure how people actually respond in different situations. If that's in a supermarket, or if it's watching ads on social media, or if it's going through a new app, or trying a new website, or unpacking a product. And I think that the big change happened 3 years ago when we took in investors for the first time. So as a company, my company has really been focusing on doing the eye tracking in EEG. And since the beginning, I also always wanted to kind of see, is it possible to create IT solutions or a kind of predictive solution that is that gets us away from having to do testing every single time. And today it's very obvious that everybody talks about AI, but 3 years ago it was still kind of a relatively bold move to say, hey, we're going to build an AI company, or we're going to make our company into an AI company. So that's kind of the big change. And I think that what I see as the big shift, both for the company, but also as the industry as a whole, is that when you have very good data and you have very good metrics that have proven that they can predict consumer behavior, for example, you can now start training AI models and machine learning models to actually do the same job or even do stuff better for you. So I think that's kind of the big change that we see AI coming into the neuromarketing, but also the marketing field. And that's right now, it's a boiling point, right? There's so much stuff going on, it can even be very hard to figure out what's going on. At the core, I would say that science is still very much at the core. It's very important not to just think that you can put on a EEG brain monitor and just press a button and out comes some fancy metrics. There's still a lot of science you need to be sure that you do correctly. But as a user of this, you should be expecting that things are easy to use, so to speak. That's big change I see currently.
Really nice. You have a very interesting concept from neuromarketing. It's the consumer neuroscience. That's the topic of this episode that you developed with Stanford University, I think. It's the 4 powers. Can you explain how it works? I think it's you have half an hour to explain. I think that's enough.
Sure. I won't spend half an hour just to give a kind of intro, at least. I think that if you look at, first of all, to say consumer neuroscience, and I think the consumer neuroscience and neuromarketing, they are 2 concepts that seem to be used overlappingly, at least, right? And if you think about it, if you look back at how things started, you had Ole Schmidt, for example, who is a professor at the Erasmus University in Holland. He was the guy that came up with the concept neuromarketing, because we're using neuroscience to improve marketing, basically. And then there was a lot of research and companies starting to do this. And all of a sudden, you had some academics, for example, you had Peter Kenning, you had Marco Hubert, and you had Hilke Plasman, who said, we don't like the concept of neuromarketing, it's too commercial. We'd actually like to come up with a concept that is more academic, so they call it consumer neuroscience. So from that, they say neuromarketing is commercial and consumer neuroscience is academic. And then right now, it seems that companies are kind of mixing the concepts again. So at least the concepts, I prefer to say neuromarketing is the commercial application of neuroscience tools to improve marketing, while consumer neuroscience is the academic study of how the brain makes consumer decisions, right? So that's easier to understand, so to speak. And, some people, including myself, are actually doing both. But that it means that consumer neuroscience, that's what we publish in academic papers, and neuromarketing is what we do for commercial clients, for example. At the core is still you still need to know your science and your tools and do the statistics and everything. Now, for many years, and I think that the past 20 years, it's been shown that consumers, when we're making decisions, you can't just ask people, why did you choose this and what are you going to buy in the future? It turns out that we're actually pretty poor at predicting what we're going to do in the future, and we're actually very bad at understanding why we choose what we choose. So surveys and interviews and focus groups are okay to understand the world that people live in, so to speak, that what I'm talking to my friends and my family about why I'm choosing certain things. But if we really want to understand how people make decisions, we need to use neuroscience and behavioral measures to be able to understand and predict how people are choosing. So for the past 20 years, we've shown that. It's been shown in academic studies, and there's been a lot of companies that have done this for many years. But what we found was that there was a problem, was that it was very easy for us to be convinced that we were doing the right thing, but it was very hard for people to understand, okay, how can I use this? So we had a very good collaboration, and we still have that with Professor Baba Shiv at Stanford University. And also we work with academic institutions around the world. We still publish papers to kind of advance the way that we understand consumer behavior. And what we found was that what if we could take a step back and say, what are the most important things that you can say with neuroscience that you just can't ask people questions about, and that still impacts and drives people's behavior? And we found that within the first second or couple of seconds of watching an ad or dealing with the product or going on the website, there are certain types of responses that seems to be very important. And we found 4 of them to be important. The first we call stopping power or attention. So you can imagine going on a social media feed, you scroll. What is the likelihood that you will stop and watch an ad or a post? So that's like, what is the stopping power of that ad, so to speak? And what is the ability of that ad to engage you and keep on looking, so to speak? So that's like, you can measure that with eye tracking. You can also measure it with behavior, for example. So if people are stopping on the screen. The second we found was how do we actually engage consumers? We call that persuasion power. So what is the emotional response that makes people say, that's interesting? And they don't even have to think about it. It's more like a gut reaction they have that's like, this is relevant to me. And they keep on watching for a few more seconds. If it's irrelevant, they would just move on, right? So that's what we see, that emotional responses, and we can measure that directly from the brain, or we can measure it as changes in sweating on the palm of your hand, or pulse, or respiration, or other types of responses that indicate that something is relevant to that person. So that's what we call emotional responses, or the persuasion power, the persuasion of engaging people, so to speak. It's not persuading people to buy, but it's persuading people to engage with the content you provide. After that, and that response happens, attention happens within the first 100 milliseconds. It's like 1/10 of a second. That's actually when we see that people start paying attention to things or not. And emotional responses, they tend to happen within, less than half a second. So 300-400 milliseconds. That's when they start having emotional responses that actually impact on whether they are going to engage with the content. Then after that, we also see that once you keep on looking at it, you start reading and you start looking at it, you start to compute or understand what the message or the ad actually tries to tell you, or not. A horrible ad will confuse people, for example, or it's information overload. And that's what we call transmission power. So the ability of the ad to transmit the message you want to get across. And you see in some ads sometimes that, you basically don't understand what's going on. And other ads are very good at just saying organic food or whatever it is, right? So that's, do you get the message, so to speak? And that's what we also call cognitive processing or cognitive demand. So are you actually processing the information? And this can also be measured on the brain through EEG, for example. And it's hard to use other measures for that. And then finally, if you succeed on having attention, getting emotional responses, and cognitive comprehension, you can hopefully get to the point that you actually create a memory of that. So you see an ad, is your ad remembered? But also, do people actually remember the brand that it was for afterwards? And that's what we call locking power. Is the ad, for example, able to lock memory for your brand and the message you want to get across? So that's like the 4-power model: is attention, emotion, cognition or understanding, and then memory. So that's like it's like a bare minimum, the way I see it. It's like that's at least what you need to be sure when you're doing commercial, marketing or packaging or web design. You need to make sure that you get attention, you engage your customers, you are understood, and you don't confuse people, and you create positive memories, right? I think that can be measured. And also, if it's measured, you can now start testing and see what works. So that's in a nutshell what the 4-part model is, so to speak.
Amazing. Amazing, Thomas. One of the major limitations of applying neuromarketing research has always been the high cost and delay in responding to research carried out in the lab. How has AI been contributing to addressing this limitation, and what are the possibilities for the future of neuromarketing?
That's a very good question. This is straight to the new development that we see within this field, is that when the science is done right, you can start training AI models to actually predict what you would usually have to measure. So let's say, for example, we have tested hundreds of thousands of people at this point. So it's almost 200,000 people we've tested at this point. Some of them with eye tracking EEG, some of them with implicit measures and behavioral measures, but all in all, we have a huge database of billions and trillions of data points, basically. What is really important is that you don't only collect data, but you also need to have measures that are very good at measuring exactly what you want to measure. And this is one of the problems I think that we've seen in neuromarketing, is that people say, oh, we have a measure of emotional responses, and they just do something, and it turns out it doesn't actually measure emotional responses, for example. So I think that's one of the things that I've always kind of been hammering a little on, is that let's do the science right, because if you do the science right, then you can create these AI models. Now, with that in mind, that means that our approach has been, instead of saying we can predict everything, we have said, what can we predict? What seems to be predictable behaviors? So we look at emotional responses, cognitive responses, it could be empathy, it could be a lot of things. And some of these responses, people are very incoherent. People are responding very differently to the same thing. But other things, people are responding very similarly to things. So we're picking out the ways that the places where people actually respond very similarly, and we say, let's at least start there and say, these are the things that we can predict fairly well. So my classic example is that if you look at a cinema, for example, and you look at the audience when they're watching a horror movie, for example, or when they're watching a romance, for example, you will see that when people look at the romance, some people pay attention, some people don't, and some people look away, and stuff like that. And in a horror movie, people are tuned in. So everyone is jumping in the chair during the jump scare, and some more, some less, but everyone is jumping, right? So what we are looking for is that kind of what everyone seems to be doing, because that's a very good candidate for training AI models. So that's what we've done. So we can now predict eye tracking with a 95% accuracy. So that basically means that if you take 100 people and 100 people and you test them with eye tracking and you compare the results, that's as accurate as it is. So it's basically predicting how people will respond in the market. So just to focus on eye tracking for now, usually if you do an eye tracking study with eye trackers on or under your screen, it will cost you maybe 10,000 euros or $10,000, let's put that, for a study where you test 50 people, for example, from some kind of segment. It will usually take 3 to 4 weeks, maybe 2 to 4 weeks. And it will also be a report you get. It's fairly complex and difficult to understand. So you will now, and then as a client, you would now have to say, okay, I get this result. What should I do? And I need to have the knowledge in-house to say, I need to do this. And then you can't really try it again and test it again, because that will cost another 10,000, another 3 weeks, and more time. So you can imagine then that if you now can upload an image and you get the same results in 15 seconds, as if you were doing that big study, and it costs you the price of that will actually be, for one study, you get a whole year of unlimited analysis with AI. That's kind of the context here. So if it costs you 10,000, for example, for doing a single study where you test, let's say 5 different assets, you can pay the same for have unlimited 365 days per week, day and night. You can try whatever you want. You can be crazy and try some crazy ideas out. It doesn't cost you more than that single thing. That's the big difference. And that's kind of the big change, so to speak. And now that's only for attention. And you can do the same thing for emotional responses. And soon we're going to predict, we actually already now are working on predicting memory as well with good success. So the 4-pound model is kind of our workhorse to say, can we predict emotional attention, emotion, cognition, and memory? And if you can do all that for a fraction of the cost, not even the fraction, it's a decimal on the decimal on the point, right? So I think that it's a no-brainer for people. And what we see is that people who never had access to this before, they said, you know, I don't have the budget to do an eye tracking study or a neuromarketing study, but now I can have my whole design team work on this every time. So they always test things before they even tried A/B testing, for example. So that's kind of the big change that we're seeing.
And that's a great innovation, right? And talking about innovation, innovation is what changes the world, the companies and the society. And you have a book, it's called Leading Transformation, How to Take Change of Your Company's Future. It's a long title. And you talk about innovation. And can you share with us what's the central idea of this book and how you believe neuroscience can contribute to developing this kind of innovation into the organizations?
Yes, that's a very good question. So the book is a product of a lot of the work that I've done together with Kyle Nell, who was initially the head of global innovation at Lowe's, a huge home improvement company in the innovation labs that he started. And he was later at Singularity University, part of the management team there, or the leadership team there. And now also with Nathan Furr, who's a professor at INSEAD in Paris. And we worked together for many years, especially Carl and I worked for many years together on how he was sitting basically at a big company and say, we want to do innovation. You know, we're a home improvement company. We know that there are, you know, virtual reality, 3D printing, human robot interaction, and this like very much out there, but how can we actually start testing it? And how can I as a innovation manager, how can I make my director and my CEO think this is interesting, right? And what we found was that innovation in companies was very variable. On the one side, you had many who were very fearful. Everyone talked about doing the big moonshots and the big leaps, but it seemed very abstract. It seems like taking a big risk, so to speak, right? And on the other side, you have people who just did things. And just like they made an innovation lab in Silicon Valley and they hired some people with long beards that looked weird and then sent the leadership team just to look at them. And it's like, that was very kind of crazy. And what we found was that there was actually 3 main steps that seemed to work, at least in the beginning. It seems to work at Lowe's. And then we tried it in many different places and it seemed to work again and again and again. So the first step is to create a future narrative. So it's like our brains are very wired for storytelling. So if you think about what you're doing when you get tired, you're at home, you turn on Netflix or television or listen to podcasts or whatever it is, or you read a book, it's all about storytelling, right? So our brains are wired for stories. And I think that when we're doing innovation, it becomes this abstract, very technical thing. And our brains doesn't work very well for our brains. So instead, what we found was that what if we could make people tell stories about the possible futures? So what Carl did, for example, was to have science fiction authors to write possible stories about, let's say, virtual reality in this. And this is before virtual reality became famous, right? So what if we had virtual reality in our stores, for example? How would that look for a single user, a single consumer coming into the store and trying stuff out? And they even made comic books out of it to make it even more visible for people how that could look. So that's the first step. It's like, how can we make storytelling? How can we create stories about the future? And I found that if you ask people to think 10 years ahead, it's much better than thinking about the next 2-3 years. Because 10 years ahead is so far away that people will say, okay, anything goes, I can be crazy. No, nobody's going to punish me for that. So I'll think 10 years ahead. And the second criteria is you need to make people think about a single person or a small group or 2 people, for example. They need to be like people in real life that you focus on. And they need to have a problem that this new technology should fix. That's and it's storytelling, so to speak. That's the first step. That's when you actually get the discussion going and you talk about how could this look? How could that solve a problem for another person in the future, for example? So it becomes very kind of visible and visceral to people. The second step is then to look at, okay, what is in our way that we can start creating that product? What are the bottlenecks? Is it the team? Do we have processes that are problematic? Do we have the wrong KPIs? Do we, what are the people and the processes we have? And so that's what we call breaking bottlenecks. So we had to identify, we as people tend to have certain ways that we respond to innovation. So one thing is that it's uncertain what happens. We tend to kind of take a little step backwards. We feel we need to feel secure again. We also see the other extreme is that when people are running a project to develop something, they tend to hold on to it far too long. And they tend to give much more value to that it not necessarily has to be. So there's a lot of behavioral biases and psychology here at play. So mapping that out, we call it bias mapping. Understanding the process in the team and the company as a whole is really important. And do you have the right mix of people as well? And then finally, once you have committed to a vision for a future, and you have said, okay, we are now cleaning our slate and we have found the right team and we're setting up a process, then the question becomes, how are we measuring progress? So instead of saying, I have this moonshot and in 2 years from now, we're going to stand on the moon, right? That's very abstract. So what are the step-by-step processes we need to have in place? And also, how can we measure whether we have success along the way? And one of the things that we found very early on is that we can't just ask people. It's like the neuromarketing all over again. Is you can't ask people questions because either we don't know why we're choosing as we're choosing, or we're very bad at predicting why we're going to choose the way we choose. So we came up with the concept of future KPIs, or future key performance indexes, for showing basically how can we measure that with neuroscience in our case. So measuring how people responded to a completely new product. It could be virtual reality, it could be interacting with a robot in a store environment, for example, because you can't just ask people about it. What we found was that when we tried some of these devices on, the Microsoft HoloLens, the early version of that, for example, was that people took it off and they said, oh, that's great, it's amazing, and they left it and they would never touch it again, right? So there was a disconnect between what they said and what they did. But we could see when we measured their brain responses that it was too overwhelming. It was stressful for the brain to actually to focus on it. So that meant that we can detect things within neuroscience that people didn't even know themselves, so to speak. So that's like the 3 steps, is that we first need to create a vision. We need to be good at storytelling. We need to have people align on the same story and the vision. The second is that we need to break the bottlenecks. We need to be able to kind of tease apart the problems that we have and the opportunities we have from a behavioral and a psychological perspective. And then finally, we need to have some goalposts with the future KPIs that we can measure progress on, our innovation journey. And that's basically what the book is about, how we did that and how we implemented that in anything from Google to, people rapping on stage, for example, as a way to pitch new ideas, for example. So it's been a pretty crazy ride, let's put it that way.
Thomas, you very recently released a book in Danish that has not yet been translated into English. The title of the book is Why You Buy. What can you tell us about the response to the title of your book? What is the central idea, main topics of the book?
Yeah, good question. And so the thing is that in Danish, it was actually the backstory here is that I started writing the book in English. And then I was contacted by a publisher in Danish that said, we would like to support you in writing a book in Danish for bachelor students. So the original book in English was intended to be much more kind of popular science and more accessible. But this, the Danish book became more academic for bachelor students and master students. So, and in Danish, it's called Købehjernen, which is directly translated into the buying brain. And unfortunately, that title is already taken for a book. So that was a book that was written at least 10 years ago, I think. So when I wanted to translate that, and also the book is different in English. It's actually in what I find to be a much update version. So once it's the book Why You Buy is actually the book as it should have been, so to speak. So I've written the book finalized in English. And I took the Danish translation and integrated that as well. So actually, the book is now being typeset. So it's just weeks away before the book is actually out. The book itself is about this 4-power model, the way I say it. So it's a popular science approach to why are we talking about these 4 different powers, and what is the status of neuromarketing and consumer neuroscience in general these days. I think there's been long overdue to have a book that actually talks about some of the recent stuff that goes on instead of looking too much backwards. So the book is taking, a little bit about the background of neuromarketing and why is that interesting. And I'm a science nerd. I'm also a history nerd, so I love kind of throwing in, all the references to how people have been struggling to talk about other parts in science, and how we can see similarities to the struggles we see in neuromarketing today. And then I end up, the main part of the book is about explaining that 4-power model, how we measure it, why is it relevant, and how recent approaches such as online tests, implicit tests, and AI can be used to understand and predict and affect and kind of impact, commercial communication, for example, and packaging and things like that. So it's basically kind of a book of the 4-power model with a lot of wrapping and storytelling, as I would like to read it myself.